we shall commence this module by discussing a brief about 12th Finance Commission. According to Article 280 of the Constitution, the Finance Commission is selected by the President of India after every 5 years. 12th Finance Commission was set up by the President of India on 1st November 2002 under the chairmanship of Dr. C. Rangarajan to give recommendations on specified aspects of center-state fiscal relations during the period of 2005 to 10. The Commission reviewed the state of the finances of the Union and the states and suggested a plan by which the governments may bring about a restructuring of the public finances to restore the budgetary balance, achieve macroeconomic stability and reduction in debt along with equitable growth. After studying this module, you shall be able to understand the relevance of 12th Finance Commission, understand the recommendations of 12th Finance Commission, examine the restructuring of the public finances by the Commission, and understand the fiscal reform facility, debt relief and corrective measures adopted by the Finance Commission. Now, we shall move on to discuss the terms of reference. The Commission gave its recommendations in the following matters. First of all, the distribution between the Union and the states of the net proceeds of taxes which are to be divided between them under Chapter 1, Part 12 of the Constitution, and the allocation between the states of the respective shares of such proceeds. Secondly, the principles which should govern the grants in aid of the revenues of the state out of the Consolidated Fund of India under Article 275 of Constitution. Thirdly, the measures needed to augment the Consolidated Fund of a state to supplement the resources of the panchayats and municipalities in the state. The Commission recommended a scheme of fiscal transfers that will serve the objective of equity and efficiency within a context of fiscal consolidation. The effort needed to achieve fiscal consolidation should be seen as the joint responsibility of the central and state governments for achieving vertical and horizontal balance consistent with the responsibilities of the two levels of governments in respect to providing public and merit goods and services. Both the center and the states will have to raise the level of revenues in relation to their particular revenue bases and exercise restraint in undertaking unnecessary expenditure commitments. In the context of horizontal imbalance, Commission found equalization approach appropriate to transfers as it was consistent with both equity and efficiency. It had not, however, been possible to implement this approach fully, as the extent of disparities in the per capita fiscal capacities of the states was too large and some of the better off states were also in serious fiscal imbalance. In the devolution scheme recommended by 12th Commission, efforts were made to strike a balance among different criteria reflecting deficiency in fiscal capacities, cost disabilities and fiscal efficiency. 12th Commission focused on education and health as the two critical merit services. The highest priority aimed at reducing disparities in the level of service provision and recommended conditional grants within the framework of equalization approach. In the order of fiscal transfers for the correction of vertical imbalance, 12th Finance Commission recommended an increase in the share of states in the divisible group of taxes to 30.5% from the previous level of 29.5%. This increase can be accommodated by the central government by cutting their activities that fall in the domain of the states. The suggestive limit of overall transfers out of the gross revenue receipts of the centre increased from 37.5% to 38%. 12th Finance Commission also laid emphasis on consolidation of local bodies in keeping with the constitutional order for effective and autonomous local self-governance, and recognized that local bodies must be supported by an arrangement of transfers that will encourage decentralization and own effort for raising revenues. The recommended transfers for the local bodies constitute about 1.24% of the shareable taxes and 0.9% of the centre's gross revenue receipts. 12th Finance Commission also recognized that there was a heavy debt burden on the states, therefore provided a scheme of debt relief in two parts. First, the relief that came from combining the past debt and rescheduling it along with interest rate reduction. Second, debt write-off, which was linked to the reduction in the absolute levels of revenue deficits. Both reliefs would be available only if states enact suitable legislations to reduce the revenue deficit to zero by 2008-09 and commit to bringing down the fiscal deficit in a phased manner and possible for states to pursue their development goals with fiscal prudence. This was highly cited in the Commission report. 12th Finance Commission also argued for institutional changes required to overcome some of the structural problems in managing government finances. One central change relates to the regime of government borrowings. It suggested that states as centre must decide their annual borrowing programs within the context of their particular fiscal responsibility legislations. Also, there was a need to let the states access the market directly for their borrowing requirements. The overall limit to their annual borrowings from all sources should be supervised by an independent body like a loan council with representatives from Ministry of Finance, Planning Commission, Reserve Bank of India and the state governments. This council may, at the beginning of each year, announce borrowing limits for each state, taking into account the sustainability considerations. It also suggested for delinking grants and loans in plan assistance, as this need to be determined on different principles was part of the reform of the borrowing regime. 12th Finance Commission aimed at restructuring government finances through virtuous cycle of reforms, robust government finances, equalizing system of fiscal transfers to establish a sound federal fiscal system in India. Aimed at a positive growth dividend, progressively fall in revenue deficits relative to GDP, fall in government dis-saving and an increase in the overall savings with GDP. Aimed at higher tax GDP ratio combined with higher growth on a sustained basis and fall in interest payments, and to create the necessary space for increasing government capital expenditure and productivity enhancing non-interest, non-salary revenue expenditure. Let us now discuss the 12th Finance Commission for restructuring public finances. By 2009-10, the combined tax GDP ratio of the centre and the states was expected to be increased to 17.6%, primary expenditure to a level of 23% of GDP and capital expenditure to nearly 7% of GDP. The combined debt GDP ratio with external debt measured at historical exchange rates, it was expected that it should at a minimum be brought down to 75% by the end of 2009-10. Further, it was suggested that the system of on-lending should be brought to an end over time, and the long-term goal for the centre and states for the debt GDP ratio should be 28% each. The fiscal deficit to GDP ratio targets for the centre and the states was to fixed at 3% of GDP each. The centre's interest payment relative to revenue receipts, it was expected that they should reach about 28% by 2009-10. In the case of states, the level of interest payment relative to revenue receipts was expected to fall to about 15% by 2009-10. The revenue deficit in relation to GDP for the centre and the states for their combined as well as individual accounts was expected to be brought down to 0 by 2008-9. Further, it was expected that the states would follow a recruitment and wage policy in a manner such that total salary bill relative to revenue expenditure net of interest payments and pensions does not exceed 35%. Each state should enact a fiscal responsibility legislation which should at a minimum provide for number 1, eliminating revenue deficit by 2008-9, secondly, reducing fiscal deficit to 3% of gross state domestic product or its equivalent defined as the ratio of interest payment to revenue receipts, thirdly, bringing out annual reduction targets of revenue and fiscal deficits, fourthly, bringing out annual statement giving prospects for the state economy and related fiscal strategy, and fifthly, bringing out special statements along with budget giving in detail the number of employees in government, public sector, aided institutions and related salaries. Let us now move on to discuss the sharing of union tax revenues. The share of states in the net proceeds of shareable central tax was 30.5%. For this purpose, additional excise duties in place of sales tax were treated as a part of the general pool of the central taxes. If the tax rental arrangement was dismissed and the states were allowed to levy sales tax on these commodities without any prescribed limit, the share of the states in the net proceeds of shareable central taxes should be reduced to 29.5%. If any legislation was enacted in respect of service tax after 88th constitutional amendment was notified, it must be ensured that the revenue accruing to a state under the legislation should not be less than the share that would accrue to it had the entire service tax proceeds been part of the shareable pool. The suggestive amount of overall transfers to states was to be fixed at 38% of the central gross revenue receipt. The states should be given a share as specified in the table in the net proceeds of all the shareable union taxes in each of the 5 financial years during the period 2005 to 2009-10. Now, in context of local bodies, for the period 2005 to 10, a total grant of rupees 20,000 crores for the Panchayati Raj institutions and rupees 5,000 crores for the urban local bodies was decided to be given with interstate distribution. The PRIs or Panchayati Raj institutions should be encouraged to take over the assets relating to water supply and sanitation and utilize the grants for repairs or rejuvenation. The PRIs should recover at least 50% of the frequent cost in the form of user charges. Priority should be given to the expenditure on the operation and management costs of water supply and sanitation out of the grants allocated for the panchayats, which will facilitate them to take over the schemes and operate them. At least 50% of the grants provided to each state for the urban local bodies should be reserved for the arrangement of solid waste management through public-private partnership. PRIs and ULBs, that is urban local bodies, give high priority to expenditure on creation of database and maintenance of accounts through the use of modern technology and management systems. Some of the modern methods like GIS, that is Geographical Information System, for mapping of properties in urban areas and computerization for switching over to a modern system of financial management would go in a long way in creating strong local governments, fulfilling the spirit of 73rd and 74th constitutional amendments. State governments should not take more than 15 days in transferring the grants to local bodies after they are released by the central government. The centre should take a serious view of any unjustified delay on the part of the state. The state should adopt the best practices to improve the resources of the panchayats. The suggestions made by 12th Finance Commission in respect of state finance commissions should be acted upon with a view to strengthen the institution of SFCs so that it might play an effective role in the system of fiscal transfers to the third tier of government. Next, in context of calamity relief, the scheme of Calamity Relief Fund, that is CRF, comprised of contributions from the state and the centre in the ratio 25-75. The definition of natural calamity covers landslides, avalanches, cloudbursts and pest attacks. The centre continued to make allocation of food grains to the needy states such as relief measure, but with a transparent policy. The extent of CRF worked out at rupees 21,333.33 crore for 5 years. The scheme of NCCF constituted in its present form with a corpus of rupees 500 crore. The outgo from the fund might continue to be replenished by the way of collection of national calamity contingent duty and levy of special surcharges. Further, the provision for disaster preparedness and mitigation needs to be built in the state plans and not as a part of calamity relief. Next, in context of grants in aid to states, the system of striking a 70-30 ratio between loans and grants for extending plan assistance to non-special category states and 10:90 in the case of special category states should be done away with. Instead, the Commission suggested that the Centre should confine itself to extending plan grants to the states and leave it for the states to decide how much they wish to borrow and from whom. A total non-planned revenue deficit grant of rupees 56,855.87 crore was recommended during the award period for 15 states. 8 states were recommended for grants amounting to rupees 10,171.65 crores over the award period for the education sector, with a minimum of 20 crore in a year for any eligible state. 7 states have been recommended for grants amounting to rupees 5,887.08 crore over the award period for the health sector, with a minimum of rupees 10 crore a year for any eligible state. The grant for the education and health sectors are an addition to, over and above, the normal expenditure to be incurred by the states in these sectors. A grant of rupees 15,000 crore over the award period is recommended for maintenance of roads and bridges. An amount of rupees 5,000 crore was suggested as grants for maintenance of public buildings. The maintenance grant for roads and bridges and for buildings are an additionally over and above the normal maintenance expenditure to be incurred by the states. A grant of rupees 1,000 crore was suggested for maintenance of forests. A grant of rupees 625 crore was recommended for heritage conservation, that is, preservation and protection of historical monuments, archaeological sites, public library, museums and archives, and also for improving the tourist infrastructure to facilitate visits to these sites. An amount of rupees 7,100 crore was suggested as grant for state specific needs. Lastly, we will discuss the fiscal reform facility, debt relief and corrective measures in this module. Each state must endorse a fiscal responsibility legislation prescribing specific annual targets with a view to eliminate the revenue deficit by 2008-09 and reduce fiscal deficit based on path for reduction of borrowing and guarantees. The central loan to states contracted till 31st March 2004 and outstanding on 31st March 2005 totaling rupees 1,28,795 crores may be consolidated and rescheduled for a fresh term of 20 years and an interest rate of 7.5% be charged on them. A debt write-off scheme connected to the diminishment of revenue deficit of states may be presented. Under the scheme, the reimbursements due from 2005-06 to 2009-10 on central loans contracted up to 31st March 2004 and prescribed to be consolidated will be eligible for write-off. The quantum of write-offs of reimbursement will be linked to the absolute amount by which the revenue deficit is diminished in each successive year during the award period. The central government should allow the states to approach the market directly and not act in between for future lending. If some fiscally weak states are unable to raise funds from the market, the centre could borrow for the purpose of on lending to such states, but the interest rates should remain aligned to the marginal cost of borrowing by the state. External support may be relocated to states on the same terms and conditions as attached to such assistance by external funding agencies, thereby making Government of India a financial intermediary without any gain or loss. The external support passed through to states should be managed through a separate fund in the public account. All states ought to set up sinking funds for repayment of all loans, including loan from banks, liabilities on account of NSSF, etc. The fund ought to be maintained outside the combined funds of the states, and the public account should not be used for any other purpose except for recovery of loans. States ought to set up guarantee improvement funds through reserved guarantee fee. This should be preceded by risk weighing of guarantees. The quantum of contribution to the fund should be decided as the need may be. In context of profit petroleum, the Union ought to share the profit petroleum from NELP areas with the states from where the mineral oil and the natural gas are created. The share should be 50-50. The revenues earned by the central government on contracts marked under the coal bed methane policy might be shared with the producing states in the same manner as profit petroleum. In respect of any mineral, if a loss of revenue was foreseen for a state in the process of implementation of a policy which involves production sharing, a similar compensation mechanism should be adopted by the central government. A permanent secretariat for the Finance Commission. Let's discuss this. 12th Finance Commission also suggested for the Finance Commission division of the Ministry of Finance should be converted into a full-fledged department serving as a permanent secretariat for the Finance Commissions with a tenure of at least 3 years to enable them to do their work sufficiently. The expenditure of Finance Commissions must be treated as expenditure charged on the combined fund of India. Now, in the end, we will summarize what we have discussed in this module. 12th Finance Commission was set up by the President of India on 1st November 2002 under the chairmanship of Dr. C. Rangarajan to give recommendations on specified aspects of center-state fiscal relations during 2005 to 2010. The Commission gave recommendations on the distribution between the Union and the states of the net proceeds of taxes, principles which should govern the grants in aid of the revenues of the states out of the Consolidated Fund of India, and measures needed to augment the Consolidated Fund of a state to supplement the resources of the panchayats and municipalities in the state. The 12th Finance Commission aimed at restructuring government finances through virtuous cycle of reforms, robust government finances, equalizing system of fiscal transfers to establish a sound fiscal system in India. The Finance Commission listed various recommendations for restructuring of public finances. The share of states in the net proceeds of shareable central tax was 30.5%. If any legislation was enacted in respect of service tax after the 88th constitutional amendment was notified, it must be ensured that the revenue accruing to a state under the legislation should not be less than the share that would accrue to it had the entire service tax proceeds been part of the shareable pool. For the period 2005 to 10, a total grant of rupees 20,000 crores for the Panchayati Raj institutions and rupees 5,000 crores for the urban local bodies was decided to be given with inter-se distribution. The scheme of Calamity Relief Fund comprised of contributions from the centre and the states in the ratio of 75-25. The system of striking a 70-30 ratio between loans and grants for extending planned assistance to non-special category states and 10:90 in the case of special category states should be done away with. Instead, the center confined itself to extending plan grants to the states and leave it for the states to decide how much they wish to borrow and from whom. For fiscal reform facility, debt relief and corrective measures, the Finance Commission suggested that each state must endorse a fiscal responsibility legislation prescribing specific annual targets with a view to eliminate the revenue deficit by 2008-09 and reduce fiscal deficits based on a path for reduction of borrowing and guarantees. Thank you.